Most investors focus on building up their investments before retirement, and there's less focus on how to withdraw money once you're in retirement. And it's not as simple as it sounds. If you choose the wrong strategy, it can make the difference between running out of money before you die or leaving a large sum for your beneficiaries. The strategy you choose can also make a big difference to the size of your income in retirement and the variability of your income as well. So in this video, we'll look at some of those strategies for withdrawing money in retirement in detail, and also look at how well those strategies have fared historically. The question many of us ask is, will I run out of money before I die? And there's a nice quote from Samuel Johnson who said, it's better to live rich than to die rich. And you have to decide which one is most important to you. Do you want to leave a lot of money for your family and your beneficiaries? Or really is it about living the best life you can with the amount that you've saved? And if there is some money left over at the end, well, so much the better. But if we were to draw a rough diagram of our wealth over our lifetime, then it would look something like this. It's roughly like a shark fin. So you have the accumulation phase before retirement, and then when you retire, you start to sell assets, and hopefully they don't run out before you die. Now, what makes this difficult is the uncertainty of markets. Sometimes you get good returns, sometimes you don't, and you can't really control when you're born and when you die. So we can't control the timing, but we can to some extent control the amounts we save and also the kinds of investments that we invest into. But maybe one good metaphor is to think of it like a tank of water. While we're in the accumulation phase, we're filling the tank as quickly as we can with our savings. And the water, of course, here represents our cash that we've saved into our investment account. And then once we retire, we stop pouring money into the top of the tank in the form of salary and savings, and we open up the tap at the bottom of the tank and start withdrawing money. And that's just money to live, of course. Now, a key concept here is the withdrawal rate, which is the percentage of the total amount of our investments which we withdraw each year. And you've probably heard of the 4% rule. Where does that come from? Well, if the nominal growth rate, that's the non-inflation adjusted growth rate of our investments, if that's 8%, that's making the total amount of investments increase every year. At the same time, the spending power of that money has been reduced by inflation. Usually that's around 2-3%, and that means we've got about 4% that we can withdraw every year and still be below the average rate of growth of our investments. And that way, the amount of water in the tank roughly will stay constant over time. However, these are just average rates, and from year to year, you can have a lot of things that can go wrong. Markets can fall, inflation can spike, and if we look in history, we'll see in a moment that that has happened and it's potentially resulted in some bad outcomes for retirees. So can withdrawal rules help us mitigate these risks? Well, the key risk that we're thinking about here is called sequencing risk, which is quite a strange phenomenon, but the basic idea is that the order of returns matters. If we have a really large negative return at the beginning of retirement, then that has a much bigger negative impact than exactly the same size fall at the end of retirement. And that's because in retirement, we're forced to crystallize our losses. We don't have a choice about whether to sell. And that means that if we do make a loss early on, that money will not compound for a long period of time. So a lot of these withdrawal rules try to work around that difficulty and also mitigate the effect of those negative returns. So for example, one thing that can go wrong is a spike in inflation. We've just had one in the UK and in the US and elsewhere. So if we look in the UK, for example, inflation peaked at over 14% in 2022. However, if we compare this with history, there have been much worse episodes. In 1975, for example, UK inflation peaked at almost 27%, and it didn't fall back smoothly. There was another peak in inflation of 22%, and that was in 1980, 5 years later. Now, this is a huge upward struggle for our investments because really our game with investment is to beat inflation long term, ideally by as much as possible. So if we take a global historic index, a global equity index, and adjust it for UK inflation, the inflation we just saw, and reinvest any income so it is a real total return, you can see that awful decade in the 1970s. The reason why it was so bad was that usually when you get a big fall in stocks, as you did in 1972 when they fell 14%, 1973 when they fell 28%, usually you get a big upswing following that. However, that didn't happen in the 1970s. So this was particularly difficult for retirees who were just starting out at that point in time. They were very much affected by this sequencing risk. So really, as we go through these strategies, we'll think of them in terms of whether they maximize consumption, our income in retirement, or whether they're maximizing the longevity of our pot and the amount that we'll have as we die. So before we launch into the details of the strategies, let's just look at that awful period in the 1970s to see how these strategies would have fared. What you can see here is for a 30-year period, starting in 1972 and ending in 2002, what was the income generated for each of those strategies? Now immediately you can see that one of these strategies failed quite spectacularly, and this is called the Vanguard Dynamic Spending Rule. What's good about this strategy, I think, is that it's very simple and easy to understand. However, if you do get a period of protracted inflation, it can quite easily exhaust your pot. Another strategy that failed just within 2 years of the 30-year period ending is another simple strategy, the constant real withdrawal amount. And here all you do is you choose a withdrawal rate in the first year, say 4%, and then every year after that you just inflation adjust the amount you withdraw. So if inflation is 5%, your income increases by 5%. The strategy which did pretty well at maximizing our income is the one which does that by design. This is the Boglehead strategy. Its full name is quite a mouthful. It's the Boglehead's variable percentage withdrawal strategy. The other one which didn't fail is called Guyton-Klinger. What did happen, however, which isn't very palatable for many people, is that the size of the income halved over the course of the 70s, and it took a long time to recover back to its initial amount, which was £40,000. But what I'm hoping to show you here is how variable these strategies are. And if we look at the size of our investments over time, you can see another big difference between the strategies. Guyton-Klinger is the one which maximizes our terminal wealth when we die. And even in this awful period, even though it did cut back on our income very severely, although all of our pots started off with £1 million, Guyton-Klinger was the only one that ended up with more than that. In this case, it increased the amount of the investments by about 50%. So let's start off with a simple strategy for stable income. This is the Vanguard Dynamic Withdrawal strategy. And it really is very simple. We look at our portfolio's return over the last year, and then we cap it and floor it. So it's capped in this case to 5% maximum growth and minus 2.5% maximum shrinkage. So even if our portfolio has grown by 30%, we'll only ever grow our income by a maximum of 5% plus inflation. And if the size of our portfolio is shrunk by 30%, we'll only look at inflation minus 2.5%. So this keeps our income fairly stable. It never increases by more than 5% plus inflation or shrinks by inflation minus 2.5%. So for our premium website members of our community, we've created 2 sets of calculators. We've got drawdown calculators that help us work out how much we're going to withdraw each year according to various rules. So we've got the Vanguard Dynamic Withdrawal strategy, we've got the Guyton-Klinger strategy, and the Boglehead's Variable Percentage Withdrawal strategy. You enter the details here for this year, and it comes up with the withdrawal amount. What we also have are some backtesting tools where you can use those strategies and see how well they would have fared in the past. So constant real income, Vanguard Dynamic Withdrawal, Guyton-Klinger, and the Boglehead's Variable Percentage Withdrawal strategy. So for example, if we look at Vanguard Dynamic Withdrawal and run the simulation, starting with £1 million, a 30-year retirement period, an initial withdrawal rate of 4%, and that cap and floor of 5 and minus 2.5%, you can see those catastrophic outcomes in the 1970s. So for the period starting in 1970 and ending in 2000, notice how the pot was exhausted. So the probability of success of this strategy historically for every 30-year period is just 83%. That's a pretty high failure rate. And if we compare that with Guyton Klinger, notice that the probability of success is now 100%. However, the size of our income fluctuated well below 40k during those early difficult years and stayed low for a long period of time. And the Boglehead strategy, the one that maximizes income and is designed to run out of money by the time we die, that one did a pretty good job of keeping income high. So for most of this period, the median income was well above 50k. Now the probability of success of this strategy is 100% because by design it runs out of money at the end of the 30-year period. It's designed to exhaust your pot. Now if you do want to get access to those calculators, but also to discuss them in our forum and learn more from the rest of the members who are actually in drawdown, then it's really easy to join our membership. Just go to our website, PensionCraft.com/membership. You'll also find a link to that in the description below. So now let's look at that Boglehead's variable percentage withdrawal strategy, because I think this is one that people will quite frequently use. Not all of us have the benefits of having a huge investment pot, so we want to squeeze the best possible income out of that pot as possible and live our best lives. So as we said earlier, this strategy by design exhausts our pot by the time we die. So if we're 1 year before death, then if we've got 30,000 in our pot, then our withdrawal rate will be 100%. And that's one hallmark of this strategy, which is that as our life expectancy falls, our withdrawal rate increases. However, if you've got 2 years to live, you might be slightly surprised to discover that if we start off with 60k, we take out more than half of the pot. You might be wondering why. Well, of course, the size of the pot on average increases over time. So if we look at our calculator, the one that allows us to work out how much to withdraw each year, you can see that its inputs are very simple. We have to choose our asset allocation, how much in stocks, how much in bonds, and we've got a slider here so that we can vary that between 100% stocks and 0% stocks. And of course that affects our expected return. Where do these numbers come from? Well, it's the Credit Suisse Global Returns Yearbook. Regular viewers will know I use that data a lot, but so do the Bogleheads. So 100% stocks historically has generated about 5% above inflation. 100% bonds has generated just 1.9%. Now what you do have to estimate with this approach is your life expectancy. And the Office for National Statistics has this handy life expectancy calculator for the UK. So if I enter my age, which is 55, and I'm male, and I can calculate my life expectancy, which is 84 years. However, there's also a reasonable chance that I'll live to 92, a 1 in 4 chance, and a 4% chance that I'll live to 100. Females, of course, have a higher life expectancy, so that would be 87 years for a 55-year-old, and a 7% chance of living to 100. So in the calculator, let's say we've got 100% equity, 5% expected return, and a life expectancy of 29 years if I retire right now. And let's say I've got 600,000 in my investment pot. So what this tells me is that my withdrawal amount for this year would be 37,700. Notice that if I reduce the amount of equity, that reduces quite significantly. And that's because bonds on average have a lower return. So this is why we can actually take out more than 30,000, because what's going to happen is that the amount we have left from the previous year will grow. So even though we've only got just under £29,000 left over, when we grow that by the average 60-40 portfolio growth rate, that would increase by 3.8%. And that would leave us with 30,000 in our final year. So now let's look at that strategy to make our investment pot last as long as possible and to end up with as much wealth as possible. And this is the Guyton Klinger guardrail strategy. This boils down to 3 rules. The first rule means that we don't inflation adjust our withdrawal amount if the size of our pot has shrunk over the last year. In other words, if we've had negative returns on our portfolio. That's called the modified withdrawal rule. The other 2 rules affect how much we can withdraw each year as a percentage of our invested amount. But I think the best way to understand that is with a graph. And these are the guardrails that people often mention when they're talking about Guyton Klinger. So our initial withdrawal rate with this strategy was 4%, let's say. What we then do is set some guardrails, 20% above and 20% below that 4% withdrawal rate. And what the strategy does is if we're depleting our pot too rapidly and we hit the upper guardrail, so instead of 4%, we're going to deplete it at 4.8% or more per year, then what we have to do is step back our spending. And a common number used to do that is to reduce spending by 10%. However, if we have a protracted period of poor returns, our income falls quite dramatically. So there has to also be a rule to increase our spending. And that's the lower guardrail, which you can see here, or the prosperity rule. If we hit that, then what happens is we increase our spending by 10%. So notice how the guardrails keep our consumption rate of our portfolio roughly within these upper and lower guardrail bands. Now, the drawback with this strategy, as we saw for the 1970s, is that our income can fall quite dramatically and for extended periods of time. That's the price we pay to preserve our pot. So I think this would only be appropriate if we have a very large excess of savings or we have alternative sources of income. But if you're completely dependent on this pot and the pot isn't huge, then I think something like the Boglehead strategy would be more appropriate. So I hope that's helped you understand how these withdrawal rules work and the benefits and the drawbacks of the various rules. I've just touched the surface here. As you can see, it's quite an elaborate process deciding which rule is best for you and also back testing them to see what the appropriate limits should be. But I think it's really important to understand that if you haven't got a huge pot, you can still eke it out if you use the right withdrawal rule, and also avoid a disaster which would be running out of money before you die. If you do want to join our membership, remember, then you'll get access to those trackers and lots of other goodies, and also the ability to talk to me or other members of the community whenever you like via our chat application. And to learn more about that, just go to our website, pensioncraft.com/membership, or take a look at the link in the description below. And, as always, thank you for listening.